It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. As we find ourselves entering 1944's The Mummy Curse, we also find ourselves buttressed right up against the very end of the line in our journey through the Universal Classic Monster series. Now, barring the films that were adjunct entries in the series, which were either, something like supernatural movies or movies that had some sort of ghoul or other type of monster, when it came to the actual quote-unquote Universal Classic Monsters, we really only have two more to go. Those two will be on the calendar before the end of 2024. But The Mummy's Curse picks right up from where The Mummy's Ghost ends, but 25 more years into the future of the Mummy franchise timeline. But think about that. 1940's The Mummy's Hand was a contemporary film. The Mummy's Tomb and The Mummy's Ghost moved 30 years later to 1970. Now, The Mummy's Ghost is technically taking place in 1995. Now, granted, Universal didn't really think about anything in terms of like timelines and time. Frankly, various Universal horror films had a strange relationship with era and time. Sequels would be more modern compared to the more gothic previous film, etc. It was all very loosey-goosey, and there's a big reason for that. Continuity could not really be a major part of sequels back then. There was no such thing as home video or even television broadcast of old movies, at least in the early 40s. Some people could obtain films to watch at home through a projector, but it was not a common thing for normal people to be able to do. So if you want continuity, you have to spend runtime to look back or explain what happened and where we are now and how we got there. There's not really any reason to think about what we think this takes place in 1940 and then say something is 30 years later and then another 25 years later after that. Who really cares? It's just saying something happened once upon a time, and trying not to fumble over timeline is probably for the best in a lot of these movies. Now, once again, Lon Chaney Jr. was not loving his role, as he would spend much of this movie pretty uncomfortable and under the makeup and costume. Actress Virginia Christine, who is now stepping into the role of Princess Ananka, would comment that he was drunk almost the entire shoot. Virginia Christine was another dark-haired beauty like the previous films Amina/Ananka, Ramsey Ames, and Christine had a fairly prolific career in the mid to late 40s. In 1952, she would end up appearing as Mrs. Simpson in High Noon. But she's actually best known as the Folgers coffee woman in commercials for the coffee in the 60s and 70s. Now, The Mummy's Curse opened in theaters on December 22nd, 1944, just 6 months after the previous film, and it would bring to a close the Mummy series at Universal. Karis would go on to be the name of the mummy creature in Hammer's 1959 version of the monster, and played, of course, by Christopher Lee. In 1955, Universal made Abbott and Costello meet the mummy, but that mummy in that movie would actually be named Clarice, not Karis. The mummy would not appear in the two Monster Mash films, 1944's House of Frankenstein and 1945's House of Dracula. Pretty much Universal had buried one of its earliest monster creations once and for all with this film. The final film in the Karis Mummy series from Universal, like I said, takes place 25 years after The Mummy's Ghost. While the previous two movies took place in Massachusetts and almost in their entirety, we've actually moved the story to Louisiana. But don't worry about it. We'll keep the continuity of Karis and Ananka being drowned in the swamp that is about to be drained out, but we're not going to worry too much and try to make you believe that New Englanders have to deal with a swamp and that the locals are going to be spooked by local legends. Again, we're also not going to worry too much about the time frame of this movie being something like 1995. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. Moving on. Anyway, the Southern Engineering Company is in charge of the draining of the swamp in the bayou area. However, the locals are superstitiously refusing to drain it for the fear of the mummy and his bride. But along comes Dr. James Halsey and Dr. Ilzor Zendab from the Scripps Museum, which is also the same museum that had been in the previous entries, but they're here to say that they want to reclaim the bodies of Karis and Princess Ananka. However, nasty business is indeed afoot. A worker has been found killed near the swamp. Now, Halsey and Zendab overhear and accompany the rest out to the scene of the crime to figure out, is this something to do with our mummy? The murdered man has a dagger in his back, and he's got a piece of a mummy's cloth in his hand. Halsey soon discovers an impression in the ground that looks like the shape of a person. This is where the swamp has previously been drained. So it's like he's sunk into the bottom of the swamp, but is no longer there. Halsey and Zendab believe that this to certainly be the mummy that they are looking for. But Zendab is not exactly one to be truly trusted. That night, he has a secret meeting in the swamp with a disciple of the Arkham sect, and Zendab is currently a high priest in the sect, and the disciple has set up a place for Zendab to do his Arkham stuff. He's recovered the body of Karis, but Ananka is still missing. And Zendab brews the Tana leaves and explains how all this will work and recounts the story of Karis and Ananka. And he pours a little bit of the brew into Karis's mouth, and the mummy awakens once again. The next day, a bulldozer working in in the swamps near where the impression of what would have been Karis's body was found, has continued to bulldoze part of the drained out swamp and uncovers a very old Ananka. However, when the dried mud and grossness is kind of washed away, she's young and beautiful again. A local finds her and tries to find out what her name is and where she came from, but the only word she can speak is Karis. This just so happens to be uttered as they walk past Zendab's disciple, and Karis attempts to get at her at the tavern where the local has taken her to basically rest and recover and to be seen by the doctor. But she is able to escape the mummy as he kills the tavern's proprietor. Halsey and a girl working for the Southern Engineering Company named Betty find Ananka and drive away with her to get help just before Karis catches up to them. When she comes to, she begins asking questions about what happened, where she's at, who she is. She can't even remember who she is, and she certainly has no idea how she got inside this tent near the swamp. Now, the doctor who is watching over tells Halsey that she has amnesia and kind of needs to be kept busy to help her recover. So Halsey puts her to work to help with his mummy notes, and I guess that helps with amnesia. I don't know. But anyway, while she's looking over the piece of cloth that Halsey got out of the swamp a couple of days before, she reveals to the young doctor it was indeed made from the same cloth made during the dynasty that Karis is from, and it was indeed worn by Karis. She seems to have a great deal of knowledge about ancient Egypt, but has no concept of the word archaeology. Zendab sends Karis out after the girl, realizing that she is indeed Ananka. And when she sees Karis coming for her later that night, she takes off again and seeks help from the doctor who is caring for her. But Karis follows and the doc is killed. So again, Ananka takes off running into the night. Halsey goes off with a few others looking for her, and Karis kills a couple of more of the workers. And Ananka, with Karis kind of hot on her heels, tries to find a place to stay for safety in Betty's tent near the swamp. And Karis enters and takes off with Ananka, but does not hurt Betty. Betty runs into Zandab's disciple, who claims he'll help her find Dr. Halsey, but takes her instead to Zandab's hideout. In the big conclusion, this time the betrayal over a woman comes in the form of Zandab's disciple, Rahib, deciding to put the moves on Betty. And Zandab is none too pleased with this, so he wants Betty killed. Rahib is none too pleased about this either, so he kills Zandab instead. Halsey eventually gets there to save Betty, but Rahib and Halsey get into a fight, and Karis comes along to deal with the treacherous Rahib. He deals with the former disciple by bringing down the heavy stone walls of the hideout onto the both of them. Rahib is dead, Karis is destroyed, and Ananka has reverted back to being a mummy. But let's talk about the three things that I like about The Mummy's Curse. First, while not quite as good as The Mummy's Ghost, it does have a fast pace once again. In fact, it starts pretty quick and differently than the typical Universal horror. The movie starts with a rousing rendition of a song called Hey You, sung by Ann Cody, who ends up singing a couple of songs in this movie, but does not get credited for appearing in the movie. She is the proprietor of that tavern at the start of the movie, which also gives her, a few scenes with lines to do stuff in. She's the one killed by Karis when he first goes after Ananka after she woke up and was taken to the tavern to get help. But the song that opens the movie is fun and lighthearted, and it's a good way to start the movie. It also sets the stage that these are average people in this area. The last few movies in the series featured people who weren't your average blue-collar Joes. They were adventurers, tomb raiders, college professors, college students, and whatnot. The people we are introduced to in this movie are just simple locals who have gathered at this tavern, having drinks and eating meals and having a good time. Now, next, speaking of the locals, my second like goes to the fact that there is a return to a slightly more gothic feel of sorts in this movie. It's contemporary for sure, but there's this sense of superstition and dread over what could be in the swamp and the legends that have kind of swirled around that swamp. And that picks up nicely from The Mummy's Ghost because Karis was chased by a mob that was reminiscent of Frankenstein. Lastly, I have to say, I really like Ananka's rising out of the swamp. It's kind of eerie, but also far less monstrous and almost kind of beautiful. It's like, it's a little like watching a zombie, at first rising out of their grave. You see in movies, especially like in the 80s. But once she struggles to her feet, it does seem as though the camera, is, kind of ever so slightly sped up because she has this real kind of herky-jerky way of moving as she frees herself and tries to steady herself on her feet, and then looking up at the sun to realize, oh, she's alive again. She can feel the sun. It's a really great way to spend, some time in this movie to kind of really portray this rising of Ananka in a really kind of cool way. Also, I do wish Ramsey Ames was brought back for this, but Virginia Christine is definitely a looker, and she does basically kind of embody the sought-after ethereal beauty that's thousands of years old. But that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at FilmSeizure.com. But don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can find out when episodes drop that way. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday morning Film Seizure podcast and the Monday afternoon Monster Mondays podcast at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload those episodes to YouTube as well. And you can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new review articles every Friday morning. And next week, I will kind of begin getting caught up on some TV. It's been a little while since I've done some TV. So for the next 2 months, I have a TV series to revisit. And I also have one that I made a note to myself previously that I need to hop into. But it all starts next week with a return of Kolchak the Night Stalker in the episode Firefall. So until next week, stay spooky.